Sikkim 125.
Welcome back to Sikkim 365 Radio. Have you subscribed to our YouTube channel? Search 365 Sports on YouTube.
All right, Joseph Duarte covers Houston. Brandon Helwig covers UCF. And Sam Kahn, great friend of the show from theathletic.com, and a lot of the staff at theathletic.com we've had on the show, including recently Max Olson. Sam, it appears as if there's more than a pulse with the Big 12.
There is. Reports of their death have been greatly exaggerated. Am I right?
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So I know you're working on something. I don't know what that might be, and maybe it is about this, so you may not be able to say much. But this does appear is it's not that they have targeted, but it looks as if this is not, I don't know, imminent, but UCF, Houston, Cincinnati, and Brigham Young. What are your thoughts if, in fact, when that becomes official?
Yeah, if that's the place that we end up, I think it makes it a solid conference. And because it's just the bottom line. When it comes to realignment in 2021, football inventory is the priority because you're looking for good, solid football programs that attract viewers and attract eyeballs and attract interest and can be competitive and successful. And those four programs that you're adding all have recent histories of success. BYU has been consistently successful. Cincinnati, of course, last year had a huge year. UCF, we remember, what they've done in recent years, and Houston is a little bit more removed from it, but, went to a Peach Bowl in 2015 and had a good run under Tom Herman, a good run under Kevin Sumlin. They've been very committed in terms of spending on facilities and coaching hires, things of that sort. So these are programs that I think would fit and would make sense for the league and to bolster it competitively in football. And I think it also makes it a really good basketball conference. But football is what drives the bus on these decisions. So when you look at who's available and who you can actually attract to the current 8 members of the Big 12, I think these 4 make a lot of sense.
Sam, how much is this? We hear Texas and Oklahoma immediately to the SEC. I mean, those are good television games. Year one. Whatever their schedule is, it's going to be a great television schedule right off the bat. Whenever the alliance happens, most of those games will be good television games right off the bat. How much of this for the Big 12 is, even though a lot of these teams might be good, like UCF and Cincinnati and BYU right now, but maybe not as attractive nationally, is about building this as a 10, 15, 20-year decision of making them good TV games down the line?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think of that in somebody like Houston to a conference that has Baylor, Texas Tech, and TCU, those are all old Southwest Conference mates. And so there's some natural interest and natural rivalries there that I think make a lot of sense. Cincinnati becomes a team that, again, is immediately competitive right now. And you bring them, they're a little bit of a travel partner with West Virginia, but I think they become a program that's a factor. I mean, you see they've competed at a very high level. BYU has competed at a high level. And so what makes good football games and what makes good TV is competitive games. It's games that have great players, good interest, a lot of competition. And I think this gets you there because, again, these are all programs that have history of success. They haven't had prolonged, feudal results on the football field. So I think in order to make a good TV product, you want a game like last night where you saw UCF and Boise State. That was a hell of a game to watch. That was a lot of fun to see on a Thursday night. And I think bringing in these programs helps you accomplish that from a Big 12 standpoint.
Sam, you covered Houston for many years. Of all the teams throughout this process, when they got brought up, there was that whole – and in our show we talked about it, like, another Texas team? Is that really what TCU or Baylor or Tech would want? Does that help them? Does that hurt them? Where did you stand on that, and why did Houston make sense as far as bringing another Texas team into the fold, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think Houston makes sense for a few reasons I mentioned earlier. Their spending commitment, I mean, they're a $75 million athletic budget, which compares favorably. It would be a lower-end Power 5 budget comparably, but they've spent $4 million a year on their head football coach. They spend $3 million a year on their basketball coach. I mean, they've got really a fairly new stadium. They've got a new basketball arena, new practice facility for basketball. They're trying to get in position to get a standalone football building for their program. So they've been willing to do all of those things to compete at that level. Of course, it's a huge recruiting base. I mean, Houston, with Texas and OU moving to the SEC and A&M already there, Houston has become a city that is rated by the SEC schools for talent, and I think that's going to continue. I think if you're the Big 12, you want to be able to keep a footprint in that city because Houston is one of the most fertile recruiting grounds in the country. And so having Houston in there, I think certainly, yes, does it help Houston? Yes. But I still think it does help the other schools as well, because then you have all these schools that are in close proximity, and they're all drivable for the most part, except for Texas Tech. And I think that's going to help from a recruiting standpoint for the Big 12 to keep a hand in that city. And of course, just from a pure population standpoint, when you talk about eyeballs and viewers, Houston itself, I don't know how many viewers University of Houston brings, but you bring those teams into Houston to play. I think Baylor coming to Houston does a lot more for attendance than Tulsa versus Houston, so to speak, or USF versus Houston, something like that. So I think having these familiar brands, I think, helps a little bit more with the fan experience.
Sam, obviously this has been down the fast track, and in the Big 12 for a while, we kept asking, where are you? You know what? And sometimes saying nothing is on purpose. Your thoughts, is there one of the four teams that you see that basically is all but imminent? Is there one that surprises you, or one that is not a part of that you would rather see a part of it?
No, I think these are the right ones. Again, like I said, going back to the previous success, some of the other schools that you've heard, thrown out there, Boise State, obviously they've had a lot of football success and make some sense, but they're a little bit on the lower end. They're behind a little bit on a budget standpoint. Their athletic budget is in the mid $40 million range, a lot lower than the current Big 12 members. So that while their football program has been very good, that's a little bit the deck is stacked against them a little bit financially in that way. Memphis is, I know, one that's been mentioned a lot, and Memphis has been competitive. I think it makes a lot of sense, but I think the four that they've chosen at this point, I think, make the most sense, again, based on football inventory. Going back to what I said at the start, was football inventory and good football programs is essentially what you're trying to attract to keep your league afloat. And those four, I think, are really fine choices.
Do you think they can really make this happen in 2 years?
That is going to be the interesting part, because UConn left the American, and of course the American has this 27-month notification policy and the $10 million exit fee, and UConn was able to negotiate that down, but UConn was not at the top of the conference. Them leaving did not damage the American the way UCF, Houston, and Cincinnati leaving is going to damage the American. That's going to have a huge impact on their revenue, just the way that Texas and OU had leaving the Big 12. Maybe not as big, but it is. But for that conference, for the American, those three schools leaving is going to have a huge impact. So I would imagine that Mike Oresco and the other schools in the American are going to do what they can to fortify themselves and try to keep this going as long as they can. So I would not anticipate it next year, but could it happen for 2023 if this thing ends up going here in the next few weeks? Possibly. 27 months from right now puts you at basically at the end of the 2023 football season. So they would have to probably find a way to negotiate it out. And then the other key part of that is Texas and OU still part of the league at that point when these schools enter? I find it hard to believe that they would be. I don't see Texas and OU want to be part of this if and when these schools come in. But I think that remains to be seen. There's a lot that still has to be worked out in that regard.
Given Bob Bowlesby and the last time that we heard from him, he was threatening ESPN. It's hard to imagine that the Big 12 is making moves like this without, some say from the networks. Do you have any sort of understanding or information on kind of the input possibly that an ESPN or someone outside of the conference per se had on their plan here and executing that plan?
I don't, but I would imagine that Bowlesby has a pretty good feel based on audience numbers and ratings and revenue and what the current contracts are for each of these conferences. I would imagine he's got a pretty good feel on it. So I don't know exactly what involvement, if any, that ESPN has had or Fox has had as a TV partner, but I would imagine that these decisions are not made without some pretty strong intelligence in that regard, because to me, if you're Bob Bowlesby, it's reckless to make this decision unless you know that these schools are going to provide TV value, because that's where most of your money comes from. And in the conference revenue is media rights and TV rights. So it behooves you to bring in somebody that's going to attract those eyeballs. So to me, I think it's reckless if you don't have at least a solid understanding of what these schools would bring to that regard.
Sam, one other thing that I have, in fact, mentioned on the show is that there may be two chapters to this. There may be chapter 1, 4 teams, we've heard them, and then once the Texas and Oklahoma exit becomes official, there could be a chapter 2. Have you heard that?
I haven't, but again, all this stuff is flying. So, I mean, it's everything is so fluid at this point, and we're all trying to nail this down. So, I mean, who's to say? It's hard to predict all this stuff. That's the thing, and that's the thing that becomes so difficult. Is and there's conversations that I've had with people over the last few days. Is okay, once this happens, what happens next, and then how long does this hold? How long do we all hold in this current state? You know, are we doing this again in 10 years? Right. That's the other question. Yeah. And that's just so hard to predict because the landscape changes. Look at how much the landscape changed from 10 years ago, from the last cycle of realignment. The last time we were talking about this, we were talking about cable households. Now that's not even in the discussion anymore because it's not about drawing cable subscribers anymore. Now it's about everything moving towards streaming and trying to figure out what brings the most eyeballs in that regard. So, and market size isn't necessarily the driver that it was 10 years ago. So these things change so fast, and the factors that influence it change so much that I think it's so hard to predict how these things go.
All right. Thank you, Sam. Good luck with what you're writing. I know that right now, this is a rapid fire. Thanks for your time on a day when you're busy. Appreciate it as always.
No problem. Thanks for having me, guys. Y'all take care.
Sam Kahn covers college football for theathletic.com. We're going to hear from Jeff Howe, who covers Texas. They have that game with the University of Louisiana coming up, in fact, tomorrow down in Austin.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what he had to say is obviously still uncertain, and you know, we're asking the questions, and he's asking those same questions, I'm sure, up the line as well. So, you know, the dust hasn't quite settled, but, you know, pretty big day there for the Big 12 Conference to be making a move like this. And, you know, I knew most of what he was going to say when I asked about Houston, but for a guy who covered Houston so long, I wanted to hear him explain. And, you know, his explanation makes perfect sense. My biggest hesitation with Houston was if they were only going to add a couple of teams. That wouldn't have made much sense to me because I feel like you're almost becoming just like a Texas league. You know what I mean? Or you'd be kind of moving your way that direction. But the fact that you have 3 other teams that are bringing different imprints, different states, different fan bases, and it's not all in the same state of Texas, I think Houston is an addition that makes a ton of sense. So, yeah, glad to see them a part of the mix, and that'll make for some heated rivalry games. And, you know, that's still going to be big-time SEC territory, but maybe this does help the Big 12 take a little bit of a chunk out of Houston once again.
All right, when we come back, Jeff Howe.